Hey,
Mhm.
ladies and gentlemen, this is Javier with the real Javier Novoa, kicking off the year with our first interview here. And it's a very interesting person. His name is Nicholas Reed. He has a YouTube channel from Moscow, Russia. He was born in the beautiful Vancouver, city that I know and love very much. And he migrated to Russia. He's an English teacher there. And I stumbled upon his channel because I was looking up videos about the great Muammar al-Qadhafi, who he also admires. He went to a museum that was started by Muammar al-Qadhafi's daughter. I believe her name was Aisha, and it is featuring her art. And I saw the rest of his channel. I was amazed because it was about all things living as an expat in Russia, as well as touched on topics of creativity and other topics. His girlfriend, soon to be wife, also stays with him there. They're both English teachers. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Nicholas Reed to talk about many topics here related to Russia, the United States, politics, or just whatever comes to our mind. Mr. Reed, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for inviting me, Javier. Good to be here.
Great. So, how did you go with hanging out with weed smokers in the streets of Gastown to meeting Mr. Zhuganov? Of course, I'm
Yeah,
just kidding. But I remember Vancouver, we went to Gastown. You know, that's a very famous area where people walk around talking to themselves. But how did you go from being in Vancouver to moving to Russia?
yeah, no, it is quite a radical change, and putting it the way that you put it is almost the reality. Um, Gastown, I've worked in Gastown. I've worked in the film industry in Vancouver for many
Oh,
years. So I've always been, I guess, amongst that kind of wealth in Vancouver and that type of culture. And you meet so many great people working in the film industry. But in terms of Gastown, it's right next to, I guess, East Hastings, where there are some elements that kind of overlap, of course. But I guess talking about my journey to Russia from Vancouver, it's quite an interesting story. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, I made the decision of wanting to learn Russian and move to Russia to become an English teacher. And that kind of aspiration goes back many years. But it was during the pandemic that I finally said, okay, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to put in the hours and actually make it happen. I'm young and I want to see this dream a reality.
so you actually did it. You learned or you got your certification there, and then you moved to Russia. So what did you do in the film industry? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, a few things. So I worked as a background actor, and I also worked as a assistant on many different projects. Some speaking roles, some of my own personal projects. Um, I also have a diploma in television and video production. So initially, coming out of college, it was my kind of goal to continue to work in the film industry for many years to come. But of course, because of the pandemic, there was like almost no work, and like the industry was just smothered because of the pandemic, unfortunately. So with lack of prospects in that area, I decided, okay, well, let's instead of wallowing, let's do something cool.
So that's always a crisis. Is always a good opportunity to refocus.
Exactly.
So what? Why Russia and Russian? What from an early age fascinated you with Russia? Of course, there are many fascinating things there.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Russia, Russia goes back many years. And I suppose it first kind of started when I was studying the Second World War in high school. And I guess they teach you, obviously, all countries and all schools teach their version of history. Um, and then reading online about the Eastern Front more, and the Eastern Front is almost not talked about at all in Canadian schools, at least where I studied, anyways. And learning about the Soviet sacrifice during World War II was very eye-opening to me, and it just kind of opened up this plethora of why isn't Russia today commemorated in the same way that Britain and the United States is commemorated for defeating Nazi Germany, and that's I guess kind of where it all began, and then it continued listening to Russian and Soviet music, studying Soviet history, learning about Sputnik and these great space achievements and in other industries, and it all just kind of took off from there.
And so why do you think? What is the main reason that Russia is sort of swept to the side in our culture, beside the modern happenings in Ukraine, which we'll talk about? But it's gone on long, long before that in the
Yes.
West, between the West and Russia.
Well, I think from my perspective, the main cause is that there's some ideas here, I guess you could call a collective mindset that um, the ideas that were implemented in the Soviet Union and still are prevalent today in modern Russia, there are people in the West who don't want those ideas to um, come over the ocean, you could say.
What are some of the main differences you would say between the West's ideas and the communist ideas? Because some of them do overlap, but what would you say probably is the main difference? The main thing we don't want coming over here, so to speak, quote unquote.
Right. I guess the main thing is the property question, and
The
if
property question.
and collective ownership is the main idea. And
So
for example, in the Soviet Union, everything I guess you could say was state owned, but I guess from the Soviet perspective, it's owned collectively by society, and that idea is still the legacy is still here in modern Russia about that being the case. And I guess it's somewhat of an Eastern idea, the collective mindset of society. And in the West, I guess the individual is highlighted more and individual ownership.
yes, I don't know if you saw the converse or one of the conversations between the and my Russian pronunciation is going to be horrible, but you know Alexander Dugin,
Yes.
and
Oh, yes, of course.
I'm you're familiar with Tucker Carlson as well, the American journalist. Well, he had a
Yes.
conversation with Alexander Dugin, and the main item of contention between them was that, yeah, in the West, we put the primacy of the individual first, whereas in Russia, even before communism, there's always been this ethos of a community mindset. Is that true? Or collective mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely some stock in that narrative and to what I guess Dugin was saying that the collective mindset predated the Bolshevik Revolution. And many people said that Russia, because of that type of society already being in place, that it was, I guess, right for the ideas of Marxism to take root because of the collective mindset was already in Russia.
Now, would you consider yourself a Marxist?
I would say I used to say I was a Marxist, but these days I like to just kind of flat say I'm a socialist because there's so many other revolutionaries that people should take a look at, like Muammar Gaddafi, for example, who wasn't necessarily a Marxist but drew on Marxist ideas for his own brand of socialism, which is the Green Book and the Third Universal Theory.
Would you more identify with that, the third universal theory?
I think there's definitely a lot to look at there. But like I said, there's so many other great ideas like Nasserism in Egypt, Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela, or Cuba's model. I think that socialism in any country kind of takes root in its own way. And in terms of Marxism, Leninism, it took root in the way that it did in Russia because of the conditions in Russia and the unique conditions. Like um, China had Mao and Maoism, and the DPRK has Juche and Songon for their own particular economic conditions.
Yeah, so it always takes the characteristic of the locale, and so I see a marked difference between the socialism, say, of Venezuela or Cuba, and the Marxism of Russia, and this new liberalism that could be represented by Alejandra Ocasio Cortez in the United States, people like that.
Yes.
So I'm not a communist. I did study Marx in high school and college, and I was attracted to those ideas in younger days. But I respect communism. I respect the socialism, say, of Hugo Chavez. But the socialism today seems like the wokeism. That seems like a different animal. how would you compare these two socialisms, the one that we have coming out of America that's basically a wokeism, and the true socialism that you see developing in places like Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a contentious topic because the left, I guess if you want to call it the left in the United States and the West more broadly, is so fractured with different ways of thinking. And I guess if we want to talk about wokeism and what I would say is the center left or just the center, um, really dilutes the working class movement, especially in the United States. Um, and it's precisely because things like the individual and identity politics are so highlighted above everything else, above healthcare and education, housing, and just the regular day needs of working class people, which is what we should be talking about. Not that identity politics and gender isn't something to look at, but I think what's important is the material reality that we find ourselves in, and that's what the communists here in Russia and Cuba and other places highlight more.
Sure, and that's why I believe it's called, Marx called it dialectic materialism or economic materialism. I forget the exact term he used, but that everything is. Do you think that basically all of society is basically on top of this economic structure, and that the economic undergirdings basically determines everything else that comes from that? So if we address the economic issue, then everything else will fall into place.
Yeah, I think gradually things would fall into place, and I do think that society is determined by the economic model, definitely. There's a very simple quote that I like to think about when talking about, so-called human nature, that I forget who said it, but if a worker went into a factory and started to cough because of the toxic fumes, everyone would say that coughing is human nature, even though that it's just because of the toxic fumes. If we got rid of the toxic fumes, then maybe there would be some chance, some possibility.
That makes sense. So, and we'll get on to the other topics, but I don't know if you've read into or studied anything of the Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises or any of these works, which is
I
basically,
haven't.
so these are basically diametrically opposed to communism. And there was actually a Polish, I believe, socialist economist, and I'm forgetting his name now, but he he was Austrian, but basically tried to prove socialism from an Austrian theory. But the Austrian theory basically says that economics is an offshoot of human thought and human logic. And so, therefore, the laws of economics cannot be empirical, they have to be deduced from logic. But Mises famously wrote a article that is still prevalent today about economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. And he says that because ideally in the socialist commonwealth there's no property, there can be no prices. And if there can be no prices, producers don't know what to produce. And so therefore the economy falls. And you see that the Soviet Union fell. And when the Soviet Union, well, we think it fell. And then when the Soviet Union supposedly fell, countries like Cuba, they were very impoverished. What's the socialist answer to that? I mean, clearly communism in Russia failed. Of course, communism in China is going on, but it seems that they've adopted many elements of capitalism. What say you to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of China, we can see that China is very successful, especially recently with their economy, lifting millions of people out of the poverty gap. The amount of infrastructure that they're building in China is on a scale that I haven't seen. And especially comparing to Canada, it's unbelievable what they're able to do with high-speed rail and just the cities that are there. But talking about their economic model and adapting some market-oriented ideas, I think the market just on itself is not inherently opposed to Marxism and socialism. It's the monopoly of market and the abuse of market, and by proxy, the abuse of individual workers through the market. And utilizing the market the way that they're doing it is very successful. And they're not doing it in the same way that, say, the US has. In the US, the capitalists are in the driving seat, but in China, the party's in the driving seat. and you can see how they're able to police these big companies and police billionaires. In China, if you're a billionaire, you need to, you need to follow the law. You don't manipulate the government. The government keeps an eye on you. Where in the U.S., it's completely different.
We might be going into an oligarchy. Do you think
Yeah,
we're going into a tech oligarchy here, especially with
yeah.
Trump taking the reins?
I think it's already there. Unfortunately, with Elon Musk, like whatever he's doing these days, and everyone else, Zuckerberg and everyone else, it's definitely in that direction, and it has been for quite some time, it seems.
So it seems to me, and I'm not sure in Canada, but definitely in the United States, there is a sort of pro-Russian undergirding. Even Trump is seen to be pro-Russian, and it would seem that more people on the right in the West now are pro-Russian, whereas people on the left are anti-Russian. And there's this whole free speech current. How do you see the complexities of free speech? Because in the West, most of the proponents of free speech are pro peace with Russia. But I'm not sure free speech in Russia is seen in the same way that we see it here in the West. How do you see speech and free speech, and what are the boundaries, if any, in Russia?
Yeah, in terms of free speech, I would say that it depends on the country and what you're talking about, because any, I guess, topic, depending on what administration or regime in power, can determine what is contentious and what is not contentious. Like, for example, wokeism in the West. If you go against wokeism, there's probably going to be some trouble if you're a professor or if you're a worker in whatever company that you're in. There could be some political kind of issues for you. Or here in Russia, for example, with free speech, there is a law that you cannot offend the feelings of religious people or kind of go against what the Orthodox Church here in Russia is saying. That's because Orthodoxy here is very important. So that's kind of, I would say each country has their own determination of what can be said and what cannot be said. So free speech, I would say, exists here in Russia in the same way that it exists in the US. There's just some things you can and can't say, like in the US.
There are norms. And
Norms,
so,
yes.
coming from Canada, because I've been to Canada a few times, and I know that in Canada, is socialism is more accepted in Canada than it is in the United States, correct?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you want to say is socialism or is not socialism. I would say that it is looked at more positively and not like a boogeyman in Canada, like it is in the US.
Because I know here, like for example, I don't know if you heard about this. The Russian government actually offered anybody who wanted to come, I believe, from the West visas, like if they were tired of wokeism. But if I were to migrate to Russia here, I know several people, like friends and family, that would like probably consider me, I don't know, an outcast. It would be like a death, right? Was that the same way in Canada, or is it seen as something? Okay, well, he went to Russia. That's cool. Or were people like, what the heck are you doing?
Yeah, I guess like with that, it depends on who you talk to, but I guess more largely, it's also like a what are you doing kind of situation because as far as the media concerned, Russia is the bad guy, we're the good guy, and you don't go to the bad guy's house. And I guess that's generally people's reaction, aside from friends and family who like know that my heart has always been in Russia, both because of my wife and because of my love for the country.
And that's been that way for a while.
Yeah, definitely years, decades.
Oh, wow. So you studied it through your teens.
Yes, I have. So it's been a lifelong passion, you could say. But in terms of Russian language, I only started in 2021. So I'm not quite fluent yet.
But I'm sure you read all the Russian authors, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and
Yes, I'm actually doing a series with a friend of mine who is back in Canada right now. We're doing a Maxim Gorky series. So we're reading some of his short stories and doing some discussions about it.
so how would you, I guess it's very hard to do, but what are some of the main aspects of Russian culture that you would give to someone living in the United States who has no idea? Like I don't know, because when I was a teenager, I really liked the Russian Orthodox Church, and I went to the Russian Orthodox Church. It's just very beautiful, you know, the iconography and the liturgy and so on and so forth. There's a lot of beauty in it, but yet there's a lot of pessimism. You know, Svetlov, the Russian poet, he was asked, "How are you today?" And he said, "Today, worse than yesterday, but better than tomorrow." Does that sort of capture the Russian ethos? How would you basically explain the Russian ethos to Westerners?
Yeah, I guess in terms of a quote like that, it's very common in Russian literature and in the Russian spirit, where they can they can kind of joke about when things are bad, and they have a good sense of humor about themselves. They're not afraid to joke, and I guess self deprecation is common. Dostoevsky as well; it's always there. Um, but I guess what my biggest takeaway from the Russian soul is that personal honesty is very strong here. Comparing to the United States, if you ask somebody how are you here in Russia, they'll actually tell you. It's not just
Right.
like a small talk. Like people here are very genuine. If they love you, you know they love you. If they hate you, they'll definitely tell you. And that's something that I definitely respect here because there's so much fakeness in Canada and in the US, which can get irritating after a while.
There's a mask. You're saying in Russia there's less of a mask that people put on.
Yeah, definitely. There's less of an act.
Is it?
People are just themselves and they're not afraid to, be out in the streets and sing or like play music. Like whenever I'm on the Moscow metro, there's always someone performing an instrument or singing, some classical song, and it's always amazing to see. Especially when I'm thinking back to taking the SkyTrain in Vancouver. Comparing to now, I'm so glad to take the Moscow metro rather than the train in Vancouver. So many problems.
Sure. So I saw your video. I think it was rather recent, where you actually met Zhuganov, and Zhuganov was I think he's still the head of the Russian Communist Party.
Yes, that's correct. I actually had the honor and the privilege to meet um, Gennady Zyuganov three times in the recent time. And for the video, that's when I met him at the October Revolution event back in November. And yeah, meeting him was definitely a big moment because imagine being me at 13 and just reading about, the day-to-day politics of Russia, like, what's going on there, what's the Communist Party doing and what's going on, and then, today being a part of it in some way, was really like what's going on.
It's like the fulfillment of lifelong dream.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was, yeah, honestly, I'm still a bit in awe that I met him.
And you can, I'll put a link to the video. It's a great video. But the Communist Party in Russia, it's not really seen as a challenge to Putin. They basically support him, and it's just basically seen as like a legacy movement, respected.
Yeah, it's a bit of a um, nuanced topic in terms of aligning with the government line and also opposing in some areas. For example, the KPRF and Zyuganov were very opposed to the pension reform, which was very unpopular in Russia. And of course, Zyuganov wants to bring back socialism. He wants to bring back all the benefits that the Russian people had during the Soviet period. Like, for example, if you were a employee of a state company, for example, if you were an employee of a hospital or another state company, you got a free apartment. And that was a benefit in the Soviet period. Universal healthcare and education. Um, Education is not universal here in Russia, sadly. Healthcare it is, but the quality is definitely not what it used to be in the Soviet period. And Zyuganov wants to bring that back. He wants to bring back more state planning, and he's looking to China for inspiration as well.
Now, how do they treat foreigners there? Do you feel welcome, or do they sort of look at you as a foreigner?
Yeah. Well, whenever I let's say like I speak English on the metro, people kind of like glance and they're like surprised. But when I have like one-on-one conversations with people, there's lots of joy. There's lots of joy to see Westerners here because paying attention to things online or in the media, all they hear and see is that, everyone in the West hates everything Russia or just Russians. So when they see Canadian, American, or anyone from the West coming to Russia, it brings them a lot of joy and some kind of like almost an epiphany of like, oh, maybe, it's not true and they don't all hate us, and maybe there's some chance that there can be a friendship still.
So, so you personally, I saw your videos, some of your videos on creativity and the creative space. You're a writer as well now, right?
That's correct, yes.
That's right. And how do you sort of see the creative process? Like, what is your creative process as far as writing? Do you write every day, or do you just write when you feel inspired, or what do you do to sort of keep that going? Because I know it's very easy to lose momentum there.
Yeah, and I do try to write every day if I can, whether it's editing or doing some planning or creating some new characters for my series, which I'm writing. I'm actually developing a series of novels. It's a science fiction, but it's inspired by Russian history. So it's
Wow.
involving a lot of geopolitics and talking about perspective, seeing like the villains and the heroes on both sides and telling those stories and seeing how it would be in the other side of the fence of a conflict.
And are you releasing those piecemeal, or are you going to just release the whole series at once?
So this year, I'm actually publishing the first of the series, and I have several others that are in the works, which will be coming out in the near future. And it's up on my website if people want to see a little preview of the first book. It's called Mystery of the Black Moon, and there's a little trailer there and a little excerpt talking about how this conflict started. There's a civil war which sparks, and the perspectives of the entire conflict are told of why and how, and everyone's asking questions of what the truth is exactly. And it's very applicable to what's currently happening in Donbass and what the truth is of what's happening in Donbass and how it all started. And whether you ask a Russian or an American or a Ukrainian, that answer is going to be very different.
It is going to be very different. And so, from your perspective there, and knowing the opinion of the Russians, why did this war start? Just very shortly, is it because I think in many senses it was the West and us that sort of provoked it, almost sort of invited them to start it. So, how do you think it started, and then what was the agenda of the West towards starting it?
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about the Russian perspectives on the conflict, it all started for them in 2013 when there was this coup d'état which overthrew the democratically elected president Viktor Yanukovych, who was basically aligned with Russia. And Yanukovych was hoping to bring Ukraine into the new Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union, which is and was and is trying to be kind of the new capitalist Soviet Union, if you want to call it that. So the Putin and the Russian government, since about 2007, 2008, has been trying to rein in the former Soviet republics into this new Eurasian Union. And it was his hope that Ukraine would be a very key part of this project. And with the ousting of Yanukovych, that dream was sort of lost. And the government which replaced Yanukovych had many, if you want to call it, Russophobic sort of elements to it. And the people in Crimea and Donbass didn't want anything to do with the government which followed that coup d'etat, and they wanted to be closer to Russia in some way, whether that be through an autonomous region in Ukraine or part of Russia. So I think for those two reasons, that's why this all started. It's because at the time it looked like Ukraine and Russia were walking hand in hand in this new project, and then suddenly, poof, it was gone. As well as the direction that the Ukrainian government went in after that coup d'état.
So, it looks like simply for historical reasons, Russia wants to have this alliance with Ukraine as sort of a buffer between them and Europe because very justifiably they don't trust Europe. And what are the West's motives, you think, in going into Ukraine? Is it the same thing? Is that they just want a buffer between Russia and Europe?
I think the purpose of going into Ukraine is very vast, and keeping in mind the point of Ukraine being the key to the success of the Eurasian Union is very important because going back to the days of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the second largest republic in the USSR, and it was the most abundant in food resources and also in many natural resources. And if the Eurasian Union were to be successful, Ukraine would be a very important part of that. And by taking Ukraine away from Russia or pulling Ukraine and Russia apart in some way, that kind of nullifies Russia's chance of becoming a great power again, which is what Putin's whole mission has been since coming into office in 2000.
And so Putin said that he confirmed, I believe, last week that it's Trump always said, if I was there, this war wouldn't have happened. And Putin said, yes, if Trump was there, I believe it would not have happened. So Putin does see the Trump administration favorably. How, as an outsider to the US and someone who's in Russia, how do you see this new administration? Do you think that we're going to have more world peace? Because it seems there are two elements to the administration. There's Hegseth and those elements that seem like they're war hawks. And then there are people who are talking about peace. Where do you see the trajectory going with this new Trump administration in the United States? Does it bode well for the rest of the world? Does it bode well for Russia?
Well, I think what's important to keep in mind about the Trump administration is that he and his team are kind of wild cards. One day,
That's right.
yeah, to keep using the DPRK, North Korea, as an example. One day it was, I'm going to annihilate North Korea with fire and fury. To the next day, kisses, and he's my best friend. Um, and yeah, so like stuff like that. Like he's very volatile, so we don't know where it's going to go. And in terms of world peace, we're seeing, for example, the conflict in Gaza was settled almost instantaneously, even before
Instantly.
it was inaugurated. So that is definitely a positive sign that he wants to kind of quiet things down. But on the other hand, he's saying, you know, I want Greenland, Panama Canal, and Canada to be part of the U.S. Um, so there's this weird balance where he's, you know, fire and fury in one hand, but then hugs and kisses on the other. And specifically talking about Russia and Ukraine, we shouldn't forget that it was during the first Trump presidency that he chose to actually arm the Ukrainian military with Western aid. He was, which was something Barack Obama chose not to do. It was Trump who went ahead with military aid to Ukraine.
So it's
But
very nuanced.
sorry,
It's very nuanced.
it's very nuanced, and I think something also to keep in mind is that he and his team are up against a big blob. It's what John Mearsheimer, if you know Professor
Oh, yeah.
John Mearsheimer, he calls the foreign policy of blob in the US, where they have this very well established team of foreign policy experts who want what they want, and it's hard to go up against them.
It's the deep state, basically.
The deep state, essentially. So we're talking about multinational corporate interests, the military-industrial complex. You know, you can see, for example, President Zelensky shaking hands with BlackRock. You know, and it's right there in the open, and everyone can see it.
I think Trump is in a better position now to face off against them because he learned a lot of lessons from the first term. But I was explaining this to someone the other day. You said, and even I don't know if you saw my interview with Jim Rogers. He was saying the same thing. You know, Trump's all over the place. He's all over the playing field. But if you can see, that's a negotiation tactic. Like, for example, he's saying now we're going to deport everybody, you know, all the illegal immigrants from Mexico. But he doesn't really want to do that. What he wants to do is he wants to give an extreme statement and then have the other side try to negotiate with him and then meet them in the middle. I think that's what he's doing. If you, I don't know if you would agree there. That's what he's all
Yeah,
about.
taking Canada as an example, I think that's definitely also true as well. He wants to make a big splash and to kind of get them to do what he wants, which is in terms of, annexing Canada. I think what he really wants is for Canada to step up the border security, which
Precisely.
is seems like what the Canadian government is already going in the direction of. And the 25% tariffs, I really hope it doesn't happen, because it would be very detrimental to the Canadian economy. But like you said, I think it's a big negotiating tactic to have them to negotiate these deals, which
It,
were apparently unfavorable
it
in
would
his.
be detrimental to the American economy. Tariffs are
Yes,
always detrimental.
absolutely.
I don't think they're going to do it. Well, time will tell on that.
We'll have to see.
We'll have to see. But so, how do you see the Canadian political situation now? Justin Trudeau just basically stepped down. Do you, because Trudeau's been around for a long time. His father was prime minister for a while, and his father was characteristically, or he was seen as socialist. What are your thoughts on the Trudeau family? Do you think that they did a good job, or do you think it's time to put somebody else in? Which Canadian?
Yeah. Speaking about Pierre Trudeau, he's definitely beloved in many areas of Canada. And maybe talking about Cuba, for example, he's very looked on fondly in Cuba because Pierre Trudeau had a very famously good relationship with Fidel Castro and bringing this kind of idea of peace to Cuba. Canada was known as the peacemaker during his time. I actually had a very interesting conversation with a famous Cuban artist recently at an event here in Moscow. And we talked about Canadian politics, and he's like, "Oh, who's the prime minister in Canada right now?" So, "Oh, Justin Trudeau." He's like, "Oh, his father was better."
That's right.
Kind of joking, which I definitely agree with. Trudeau, especially in recent years, has been a complete disaster for Canadians, and everyone's very tired, and they want a breath of fresh air. People are, they're choking under the economic conditions. It's completely just unlivable in so many parts of Canada, especially Vancouver.
The
Way
economy has collapsed in Canada, basically. Oh, sorry, the sound left. Can you hear me? I can't hear you.
Yes, I can hear
Oh, there
you.
you go. Okay, I
Yes.
hear you now. Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, no, I would say on paper, the country has basically already collapsed in so many ways. Putting it into perspective, if you want to rent a one bedroom apartment in Vancouver, you're paying like 3,000 USD a month for one bedroom. And like I don't understand how anyone
That's
can make it.
insane.
It's
For you said
insane.
4,000?
3,000
Three?
USD. But even
Wow,
that's yeah, for one bedroom. And
that's crazy.
I've spoken to so many people back home, that they're living with like six, seven, sometimes 12 people all in one room just to live. And that's no way to live in a society. It's just unbearable right now.
So I'm sure you're aware of the conspiratorial talk in the West that, like, the World Economic Forum is actually trying to make it to where there are fewer humans and it's harder for people to survive and there's less food. Do you think that's true? Because it seems like Trudeau's a huge component or proponent of the World Economic Forum ideas, and that we're all going to eat insects and that no one's going to own anything. Do you think that that's an actual conspiratorial thing, or we're just heading towards that economically?
I think it's I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both. I think we're heading towards it economically, and I think it's profitable for everyone who's on top, for everyone to kind of, be into their phones and to kind of be hypnotized by technology, first of all. And I guess what you were talking about earlier, it's definitely heading in that direction.
Yes, definitely. Now, do you think Canada's going to shift right? They're going to
I,
perhaps put conservatives in there.
it seems so because I think because of Trudeau and because of Chrystia Freeland and the other liberals, no one's interested in the Liberal Party. And I don't see the New Democratic Party gaining any kind of momentum in recent time, just because they hitched their wagon to the Liberal Party for far too long. So it seems like there's going to be a big blue wave, if you want to call it, of the Conservative Party, and Pierre Poilievre taking the big seats in Ottawa.
And do you think the economy gets better from there, or do you think it's just going to be more suffering of the common people?
I think there's going to be some more logic. There's more logic to it. Um, because taking, for example, immigration as an issue in Canada, um, immigration historically has been looked on very favorably in Canada, and it was a very logical system until like very recently, it just kind of like exploded and it was poorly managed. And even Trudeau had to walk back some of these policies. So I think that and like housing, for example, I think there's going to be more logical decisions made economically in Canada, like how Pierre Poilievre is saying, a common sense conservative mindset.
So that'll be good. We'll have to see that. Hopefully, Canada won't be annexed by the United States.
Yeah, I hope not. And Pierre Poilievre said unequivocally that Canada will not be the 51st state. So he's definitely opposed to it, at least from what he says. We'll have to see if he is truly a Canadian nationalist or not.
We certainly will have to see that. So now jumping to probably one of the most interesting topics here, especially from your perspective as an author and a creative person, and also because I don't know the Russian perspective on this. I don't know if you saw, Trump just launched this project Stargate in AI, where we're going to be investing 500 to 700 billion dollars in AI infrastructure and so on. I'm sure that the Russian AI infrastructure is nowhere close to the Western countries. First of all, what's the general Russian thought on AI? I don't think you can use Chat GPT in Russia because of the sanctions, but are they jumping on board? What are the thoughts from a Russian philosophical perspective on AI, first of all?
Yeah, I think AI is definitely booming here. Taking inspiration from China's lead, I think it's definitely booming in many areas, especially in the medical industry. I have many students who work for medical and pharmaceutical companies, and they're always telling me about some new Russian program that's making all these processes much easier. And maybe you've heard of the company Yandex here in
Yes.
Russia, producing AI programs and technology. You wouldn't believe that there's robots roaming around every other street corner here in Moscow, acting as food delivery guys or couriers.
So
So
that's
there's
probably more than here then, because that's not yet going on here. That's interesting. I didn't
Yeah,
know.
and there's self-driving taxis here already in many areas, which is to me it's really interesting because if you look at um, Western media, you would think that the Russian economy is on the verge of complete and utter collapse and that there's just ruins everywhere, but it's completely the opposite. Like there's so much booming here, it's unbelievable. I still can't believe it.
I thought they were driving around in carriages.
Yeah,
I'm just
exactly.
kidding,
Of
but
course,
you're
it's
seeing that from.
and that they're stealing appliances from the occupied territories because there's supposedly no toilets in Moscow. Because that was a popular story.
So you can confirm that there are toilets in Moscow.
I can confirm that there are, and they work very well.
They work very well. So they're basically AI is being embraced there more than in some of the Western
Yeah,
countries.
I would definitely say so in many areas. And we have to remember that Russia is right next to China, and Russia and China have a very close and bubbling relationship in many areas, especially in AI.
Certainly. The question is, do you even need the West? Does Russia even need the West, especially with these BRICS alliances? You can get everything you need from Turkey, from Iran. I believe Iran is even sending drones. You can get it from China. You can produce. It's probably a good, better. The sanctions have probably been good for Russia in the long run. I'm not sure if you agree with that.
Yeah, I actually do agree because maybe you know this Russian. He's an advisor to the Kremlin, Sergei Karaganov.
Yes, I've seen him. I believe.
There's this talk I watched, and he said that the sanctions were actually an opportunity for Russia and the Russian government to clean out the bad blood, in a way, both economically and politically, socially. So anyone who is the fifth column, whoever was against Russia, is not in Russia. Like who was vehemently against Russia, anyways.
The
And
World Economic Forum left.
yeah, the World Economic Forum and any companies that were, like McDonald's. McDonald's is not here. And some people are looking at it as a victory in a way because the Western companies are gone and Russia can innovate in so many areas. I've spoken to so many students from different companies, my students who work for different companies, and they told me, and they agreed that it was an opportunity to innovate in so many areas.
That is beautiful, and we'll see what happens in the coming years from there. But just as a writer and creative person, are you positive on AI or negative on AI? Because I've seen both sides. And I know that, for example, Sam Altman, I was watching a video, the CEO of OpenAI, he was saying,
Yes.
I don't like books that are written by AI, that you can sort of tell when a book was written by AI and when it was written by a human. Do you think that it's just going to bolster our creativity, or do you think it's going to take away the roles of writers?
I think for artificial intelligence, having it involved in anything artistic is definitely a bad thing. Um, I personally think it's silly for anyone to watch a movie that's written by AI.
To me,
It's
it's silly.
it's strange. It's very strange, and the same thing goes for art. Because when you buy a painting or you order some illustrations, you can see that the heart and the soul and the mind of whoever completed this piece of art is in there, and it's their perspective um, in this piece of art. And the thing with AI performing art, it's artificial. It's artificial at the end of the day. It's not real art to me. And I would never use AI to augment or to change my own writing, and I wouldn't use it. Say I wouldn't include artificial intelligence art in any publications that I would do either, because I think it also robs from artists, which is I don't want to do as a creative. And being in the film industry in Vancouver, I can see how passionate people are, and to have that replaced by AI, I think would be a big mistake.
And it really couldn't replace them.
No, absolutely.
It doesn't have
And
intuition.
yeah, and it's the human spirit to want to create and to develop and to collaborate on something that brings joy. And to replace that with AI is something strange and very spooky to me, which I really hope someone clamps down on this because we don't need AI in Hollywood. And that was a big reason for the writer's strike not that long ago. So I hope that it's completely banned from a professional standpoint.
Or at least Tim Ferriss was speaking with guests recently. I don't know if you know Tim Ferriss. He's got a great podcast, and he was saying that human made is going to become a premium. It's like when people say this book was written by humans, not AI, that's going to command a premium because you'll know
Oh,
some of this AI stuff. Again, it's very mechanical and it's not human.
it's interesting. So I guess it would be an opportunity to have something lower priced and something higher priced.
It seems like that would be the case.
Interesting.
So just piggybacking off that, are you a spiritual guy or a metaphysical guy, or as a communist, or someone a socialist? Do you believe in anything metaphysical or spiritual, or are you a materialist? Just out of curiosity.
I would say I'm a materialist. So I'm definitely a classical atheist. So I believe in science and human progress and history. But I would say there's also something to look at with spiritualism and believing in those. I think it's a healthy and sober way of looking at the world. And being an atheist, I'm not like a vehement state atheist like the USSR was. I think that was a huge mistake. I think it's important to be secular, which is something Gaddafi also believed in, as being secular and open to other religions and different spiritual ideas.
He was very religious.
He was a devout Muslim, of course.
Mm-hmm. He was. So you just really quickly because we're coming to the end here, but as a believer in science, just out of curiosity, today is the hearing of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I don't know if you're familiar with his ideas. He's going to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, hopefully. Do you believe in science as if and trust the quote unquote experts? And do you believe, say, for example, in vaccines and in modern medicine, or do you see science as somewhat being hijacked by whoever's in power, and so therefore we have to seek alternative modes of true science?
I think what we're seeing in the US in terms of vaccines and all this is a very special case where profit is getting in the way of science and where it's being hijacked, like you said, by profit. And instead of listening to the scientists, um, which we should have been from the beginning. Talking about vaccines, I think it was a big mistake not to just invest in Russia's vaccine, Sputnik, and going from there. If we had done that right at the beginning, I think there would have been far fewer lives lost and far fewer dollars lost as well. And I'm definitely thankful that Russia at the time had invested so much in Italy's outbreak in COVID-19 um, and in other hard hit areas, Spain too, I believe.
It has. So, Nicholas Reed, writer, teacher, expatriate. Hey, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a really interesting interview. I know we had we wanted to do it a few times. We had very little preparation, but I think it's been a great conversation. I hope to have you back on the show soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Javier. Glad we could get this one done.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing your videos on your channel.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll look out for your interviews as well.
Certainly. We'll see you later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right.